You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Today, John and I welcome photojournalist, photo essayist, and author Peter van Agtmael to discuss his recent book, Sorry for the War. Peter's new book is subtle yet powerful exploration of the disconnect between the United States home front and the actual wars themselves. This is personal photojournalism. This is as real as it gets. And Peter has been recognized for his hard work with many prestigious awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the W. Eugene Smith Grant, an ICP Infinity Award, the Aaron Siskin Grant, a Pulitzer Center Grant, and several World Press Photo Awards. Peter's photo essays have been published in the New York Times Magazine section, The Guardian, The New Yorker, and others. He's the author of 4 books dealing with our post-9/11 wars. His first book, Disco Night September 11, was shortlisted for the 2014 Aperture Award and named a Book of the Year by the New York Times Magazine and Time Magazine. His 4th book, Sorry for the War, is published by Mass Books and is available now. Peter is also a full member of Magnum Photos. Welcome to the show, Peter. Pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Let's start off here, though. Can you take us back to September 11th, 2001? You were this young guy in college studying history and photography, and boom, this event changed the direction of your life and countless others. What were you doing at that time, and what kind of thoughts did you have in terms of where you thought your photography career prior to 9/11 was going? Was it journalism, specifically combat photography, part of the narrative, or is this something that evolved from that day?
I was a junior at Yale at the time. I remember just kind of skipping my classes and going for a long walk and kind of trying to process what had happened. And I wouldn't say necessarily at the time I made this connection between my kind of incredibly deep, intense, interest and really obsession with photography and an equally strong interest with war and what was to follow, that day, what was to follow September 11th. But as the months passed and then we invaded Iraq about, a year and a half later, and that kind of quickly got mired in this insurgency, it kind of became quickly clear to me that these wars were not going the way that anyone was expecting. And more than that, they were going to be these long-lasting conflicts. They were probably going to be an intergenerational conflict. And sort of slowly over time, and I think it was probably a year or two between September 11th and this kind of clarity in my head that kind of my path as a photographer was probably going to intersect with these conflicts. So it was a partial realization at first, but something that really crystallized deeply over time. And because I also thought once I made that decision, I wanted to really kind of fully invest myself. The kind of photography I'd been relating to and wanted to follow in the tradition of was really kind of deep, lasting work that really kind of peeled back the layers of the onion on kind of subjects of historical and social importance.
So it wasn't, your plans in general were along that line. Your intention at that point was to investigate photojournalism, cover the news of the world. And this just was something that, obviously had to be done for you. Is that kind of the way
it all sounds kind of neater in retrospect.
Sure.
I was 20 years old and my passion towards photography was very real to me, but also very kind of, vague at the same time. I didn't really know what it meant to be a photojournalist. I didn't know if I had the capability to be a photojournalist. I didn't know how to go about it. I certainly hadn't led a life that really necessarily kind of prepared me for kind of the crucible of it. And so it was something that built over time. I needed to get comfortable and confident with myself before I could kind of take such a, intense and dramatic step that was going to kind of shape the rest of my life. So I tried to be slow and methodical about it. Well, in some ways being in a rush as well, but I tried to do it as fairly and thoughtfully as possible. So when I did finally begin covering these conflicts, I knew that I was going to be ready, and I knew that I was going to be able to last in it. But even that was a leap of faith.
Something that struck me, I was reading an interview with you, and you said that when you decided that you wanted to be embedded as a photographer and go off to Baghdad, go off to Iraq, you just emailed the Army Public Affairs Department, and in a couple of weeks, you found yourself on a plane off there. You just contacted them as an individual, or were you already part of a news organization at that point? Because that seems pretty wild. That anybody could just reach out and say, "Hey, I want to be there as a photographer," and boom, you're on a plane and you're there in the front lines.
I was a photographer with Polaris Images at the time.
Okay, so you had credibility. Okay.
I had credentials. That being said, I had very little experience, but I'd done some assignments. I'd been kind of working as a so-called professional for about a year and a half at that point. So I did have some assignments and some experience under my belt. Certainly, I'd covered the aftermath of the tsunami the end of 2004, and then I'd lived in South Africa and traveled around a lot around sub-Saharan Africa and throughout 2005. And I did some assignments for major media organizations, enough to give me the kind of feeling that, if I did go, the pictures were at least going to get published. They were at least going to be, that was the point of going, wasn't just for myself, but because I really was quite idealistically believed at the time in like the power of photographs kind of to change the course of war. So I was really steeped in the history of photojournalism as it related to the Vietnam War, and hadn't quite realized at that point that these wars and public opinion towards these wars was going to be very different than what had occurred in Vietnam.
Well, because in Vietnam, we saw the war. The pictures were very there. They were in our face. And the very people that many of the people you emulate, who you look up to, that are just reading your bio, they were there. That's where they made their name, photographing places like Vietnam and that whole period of time when your pictures really did get out there. But that's not really the case right now. I don't remember the last time I saw a combat photograph, at least ours. I see pictures from other people's conflicts, but not ours.
Yeah, well, that was unfortunately hard-won knowledge when I finally got out there and realized this disconnect between what I was seeing and experiencing and what was then being translated through pages of newspapers and magazines back home. I mean, I had a series of incidents where, this is back at the time. Some of your listeners won't even remember this, which is, I guess, is dating me at this point. But it's at the time when the news magazines were still robust, there were European editions and U.S. editions, and I would have pictures of kind of casualties that would run in the European editions of U.S. magazines like Newsweek, like Time, like Fortune, but not in the U.S. editions. The U.S. editions would have a much more sanitized picture in place of the more brutal imagery that was running in Europe. So that was pretty alienating, but also pretty eye-opening.
Do you think that was because of the editors themselves of these magazines, or was this because of pressure from above, or a percentage of each? I mean, but where do you think it was really coming from?
I really couldn't say. Because I was never in the newsroom making those decisions. I certainly, I would assume it was above insofar as a lot of the editors who I was getting to know personally at that point, were really strong advocates of trying to get this work in. And I think they were just kind of getting it in when and where they could, but they were subject to the pressures and politics of the publication. And either, editorial oversight from up high or advertising pressure or, whatever it was, I couldn't speak authoritatively to that because I was never in the room to make those decisions. But, I certainly felt a strong level of support from the editors I was working with.
And is some of this the reasons why you turned to bookmaking as a way to get these images out, or was that kind of always part of the plan? Had you always had an admiration for photo books and thought that the work would find a better home, as it were, in essays and book form, or Was it really just a reaction to the fact that some of your images were not getting seen the way you wanted them to?
It was a combination between those two things. My whole life, I've been like just a big reader and a big book lover. I mean, I go to bed reading and I wake up and I read, and it's been a part of my life and kind of identity and for as long as I can remember. So I was always interested in books. So I guess there was a part of me that was always interested in making books, and I was relating much more to photo books than I was to magazines and newspapers on some level too. I like the depth of a kind of cogent series of pictures. I related to that instinctually more than I did just single images, trying to summarize, complex events in a tiny little frame. But then also, additionally to that, as I realized that my ambition was in terms of getting these pictures published and what the realities were, it frustrated me enormously. And so I felt like I had to get out the work and the experiences I saw on my own terms. The problem with that being, as we all know, photo books are a fairly marginal part of people's everyday existence. So, you can get things out on your own terms, but it's just a tiny little percentage of the people that are going to see your pictures in print in a newspaper or magazine or now on the internet are going to see the photo book. So I've always tried to keep, both identities going, throughout the years, despite, the fact that I'm now maybe a little more realistic and a little more cynical about what I can do within the media. I still continue to believe it's an incredibly powerful vessel of communication. So, I try and be pragmatic about these things rather than just, playing some sort of zero-sum game with my own thinking.
A question I have, it has to do with editing of these pictures, basically an extension of what you're talking about right now. And that has to do with that editing one's pictures. And again, you could be a fashion photographer doing, eyeliner and become very, very involved with the editing process and feel strongly about one picture of an eyebrow over another. This is a lot deeper than that. And I would imagine that emotionally, you become very, very, very attached to some of these pictures because of what was happening at the moment you pressed that shutter button. Did you do the editing of these photographs for each of these books on your own, or did you reach out to others? What percentage of it was your gut of what should appear here and in what order? And how much of that did you look to others for a bit of guidance?
It's exactly as you say. I mean, especially early on in the editing process, when I started this kind of book that kind of became, is kind of a first book, kind of a catalog, this book, Second Tour, Hope I Don't Die, of which I kind of folded almost all of that work into Disco Night. When I started that process, I was still very attached to my memories of these experiences, and the memory of the experiences didn't always align with the photograph. And there'd be photographs that I loved because the memory was so strong that other people simply wouldn't relate to at all. And so I sort of slowly and steadily started realizing that I couldn't edit this on my own because, if the point of this was to communicate and not just have a dialogue with myself, then I needed to pick the kind of pictures that people were going to feel strongly about. At the same time, you have to find. I had to find the right people to do that with, people that really understood my work and that weren't going to go for the more obvious, more kind of traditional press images, but help me refine the pictures that were going to create the narrative I was trying to tell. And I didn't really know what that was. I had to find that out in the process of doing it. So over time that's expanded. I mean, I have the same kind of close core of friends that have been helping me edit for 15 years really now. But I always take it to kind of a broad cross section of people, some who are photographers that I know from New York, some who are friends from college, my family. My mom is a very good editor. My partner is a good editor, photographers in Magnum, of course. So I kind of try and take it through a cross section of types of photographers and with different perspectives and And then people outside the photography world who don't care about the history or the kind of visual gymnastics or conceits that we sometimes internally value, that we're relating to it just as the work itself and its role in kind of communicating the complexities and the brutalities of these wars. So that process now is, now I've gotten much better at it. It's very hard at first to let go of pictures I loved. Now it's not necessarily hard, but it's a lot easier. I'm a lot more unsentimental about it. But ultimately, just to round out the question, or the answer to this question, ultimately I have to trust myself. So I do have to guide the process and sometimes make unpopular choices, but I try and gut check myself at every opportunity.
Fair answer. Thank you.
Good answer. Yeah, very good answer. And I do want to get back to a couple of questions about the books themselves and even the forms of the books. But I hope I can jump back to ask a couple of questions about what we were talking about earlier. And you mentioned your family. I wanted to ask, when you were making this decision, and we're talking about 2003, 2004, and you wanted to cover the war, did you have family members or friends encouraging you not to, or was the support there? And then kind of a follow-up, when you arrived, what was it like for you? Were there anybody to take you under your wing? Were there other photographers? Were they helpful? How did the embedded soldiers treat you at the very beginning anyway? Or were you just kind of on your own?
I can definitely say that basically no one was encouraging me to go. It was when I started signaling my interest, maybe a year or so before I finally went, the idea was met with just a lot of distaste in a way by family and friends who were very concerned for me and thought I was biting off more than I could chew and too young, and were fundamentally just afraid of losing me. When I went there and when I was deciding to go there, it was really at the height of the bloodshed in Iraq. It was an unbelievably dangerous time. And there were a lot of kidnappings as well to boot. So there was just a series of nightmare scenarios that they could see. That being said, when I did finally decide conclusively that I wanted to do it, I was, they gave me a lot of support, grudging support, but support nonetheless. And it was very painful, especially for the people close to me in my life, the time I would spend out there in the early days or first few years, especially. I was, I'd be spending months at a time. It put their lives in limbo in a lot of ways. They never knew if the phone ringing was going to mean that something terrible happened. So at the time I was kind of young and I was whatever emotions I had of, my empathy, I guess, was being directed towards trying to cover these wars properly, and not being directed at all towards the people that actually loved me. So it was one of these kind of contradictory situations where, like, I knew the pain that they were feeling, but I had to kind of bury its effect on me in order to do what I wanted to do. Over time, that feeling changed. Over time, it became too clear that the cost that this was having both on my own life and those around me. And so I started to sort of extricate myself from it to try and live a more full life for myself and for the people around me.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, hopefully with the satisfaction that you did what you meant to do and you brought back work that's important.
Yeah, very much so. But, and
Still.
I also just got very lucky. It's as my dad would say, that I was playing a game of Russian roulette, essentially. All the skill and talent in the universe doesn't keep you from, getting killed or horribly injured, as we know from so many of kind of my colleagues and friends who were injured or lost their lives in these conflicts. So it's, some of the very best. Sometimes people out on their first patrol, sometimes people who had 15 years, 20 years of experience. So there's no telling when your number was up in these places, what was going to get you. But to answer the second part of your question also regarding when went out there, there's no one that took me under their wing because there weren't very many photographers out there at that point. This was the time where the wars had started really fading from the kind of popular imagination. This was the beginning of 2006, I'm talking about, when I first started. And so I encountered very few photographers along the way. Those that I did were generally not, I would say, particularly friendly or interested in, building any kind of relationship. They had their own thing going on, I suppose. There's one photographer, a Spanish photographer, Alvaro Ibarra-Zavala, who was like extremely generous and kind to me when I didn't know what the hell was going on. But he was I guess he was probably the only one. And the others that didn't, well, I'll let them remain nameless.
No, we'll hold that for part 2 of the show. It sounds interesting.
Yeah. Well, it taught me a good lesson that, one should always be generous with one's experience and time to those that are in over their heads. Because, I know how much I appreciated it when Alvaro, for example, kind of helped me along the way. It meant a hell of a lot. So.
Especially in an environment like that. I mean, it does not get any more extreme than that. And as you noted in this particular conversation and other places where I've been reading and following up on you, you never really knew what was going on there. You had, I think, was it a week of training for what to look out for in a combat situation? But most of the things that injured people and killed people were not in the playbook because they were hidden. They were. It was a whole different mode of. It is a whole different mode of warfare, and it is just a crapshoot. You just never know. Is it the first car in the caravan, the second, third, fourth? You just don't know. You get in, and you hope for the best, and that's scary, and it's sad and scary.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it was. What it was like. That it was a roll of the dice, and for whatever reason, I was weirdly at peace with that. I think I was, if I think about it, was probably too afraid of being afraid to actually be afraid. So, for years, I was kind of able to do this work and do it with kind of confidence. And then over time, the fear does begin to creep in, and that's when you become less. I think it made me more thoughtful as a photographer in these places, made me focus on different things, but also started to shorten, the trips and the amount of time I was really willing to spend in conflict zones,
And did you have some control over that? I mean, were you always able to kind of determine when it was time to leave and take a break and come back, or were there, editors or other institutions telling you when and you couldn't, or even the U.S. Army in that case?
I had a lot of control. I mean, the U.S. Army at that time, and that's changed dramatically. But at the time, they just kind of were like, they just sort of dropped you off at a photo operating base and said, see you in 2 months or not, depending on how things go for you. And that was it. And in the first sort of number of trips when I didn't get any assignments and things were published piecemeal that were picked up through Polaris, but I wasn't really working. But at the same time, I had no real costs either because I was embedded in those first trips. And so for the cost of a round trip plane ticket to Dubai or Kuwait, I could spend 2 months, spend $1,000. So, in a way, as a young photographer without any money, it was a good way to really do deep work without having to worry too much about the financial consequences of it. But it became also increasingly surreal to kind of come home. I didn't have any roots. I didn't have an apartment, come home and kind of couch surf between friends and family. When really what I needed, a lot of the time was a place to myself and space to myself to kind of process the experiences.
And when you came back, you were shooting obviously as well. I mean, did you consider the photos you were taking at that time kind of part of the same project, as it were, still covering the war, or were they just kind of things you were doing at the time, and later you looked at them and said, hey, this really needs to be incorporated in my final, statement or one of my statements on the war?
Yeah, well, at the end of 2006, I moved in with some high school friends, and some of them I'd gone to college with as well, and a group of friends I'm friends with still to this day, and they're very smart and thoughtful people, and we were having a lot of conversations at the time, kind of about what this work was and where it was going and where it could go, and I was really digging deep into the kind of history of the canon of photojournalism and photojournalism towards war specifically. And I really started noticing that there were really so few photographers that had kind of holistically tried to cover these conflicts, both as domestic conflicts and as foreign conflicts. And so the early kind of, seeds of the idea were kind of sprouted at that point. I think I'm mixing metaphors here. Anyhow, you get the idea. And so I started, and I'd remained in touch. I was embedded with these guys in Iraq. They were the same age as me, so I was building friendships. We had, it's partly a technological thing. We had email and everything at that point, and so I just sort of stayed in touch with some folks and reached out to them and said, "Hey, can I come visit you at home?" And that really started this work looking at, equally, and then at some point even more at the United States as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And one thing that I really learned from this embedding process too was really like how growing up in the Northeast in the suburbs and kind of going to like elite institutions, like I really, and I'm half Dutch, so I have a lot of European family, and I guess that's strong influence on my own kind of life and outlook. And I realized, boy, I really didn't know this country hardly at all, or I didn't know it outside, my book learning and my and my narrow environment. So part of it was just a desire to get to know the place I was from.
I know this is a very complex question, but when you're in battle, or when you're in Iraq and you're dealing with soldiers who are your friends to some degree, but also subjects, their experiences are similar but obviously different, and perhaps your views of what they're doing in the war themselves are different from what they're doing. Was there a real camaraderie at some points, or was there always kind of a bit of a tension between what you were doing, or even a tension within yourself, as it were, about what you're covering and what's actually happening and how you feel about it?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of these tensions. I mean, I certainly made friendships that have continued to this day. I mean, I was actually just down at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where the U.S. military is now kind of retraining to fight what they call peer-to-peer wars, which is against like a country like Russia or China. They're moving away from counterinsurgency, and I got invited down by a guy I know who is now a colonel and commands a brigade of the 101st Airborne Division down there, and he was the very first person I was embedded with back in Iraq in 2006, and he and I, though he's kind of climbed the military ladder and is very much like, a warrior, kind of a warrior scholar to the core, we've sort of managed to maintain a friendship, throughout space and time, I think, partly because, we don't always agree. And in fact, we often don't necessarily agree. I mean, and at some point, actually, when I saw him, I said, one of these days when you're out of the army and you can speak freely, I'd like you to go over the pictures from the embeds I've done with you and write your version of the reality that I saw. Because I write extensively about my version of that reality. He sees it and remembers it quite differently. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise in kind of the ambiguity of the truth, or the malleability of like facts, to see the perspective of someone, who shared the same experiences and drew very different conclusions. Obviously, a lot of our conclusions sort of dovetail as well. So that being said, there are a few friendships that I like, strong friendships that I formed over the years there. And then most people kind of, were curious about me but didn't necessarily want to get too close. And fair enough. I kind of, to some degree, felt the same way, tried to maintain this idea of not getting kind of too close with people so I could keep a kind of critical eye on things. But finding that balance was really important. In the end, you can't have that much critical distance always when you're spending 2 months, with a group of people that is, they're as young and confused and as dumb as you are. So,
as a photographer, you're there to record things, but did it at any point in time, did you feel that they did not trust you because, again, you had a different motive?
Some people didn't trust me because already there was, this sort of distrust of the mainstream media is not like a new phenomenon in society. So there were some people who clearly just distrusted me, at face value as a representative of an institution that they didn't believe in and they thought was, helping them lose the war kind of thing. Most people honestly were just a lot of people were kind of just glad I was there though, because being there meant that what they were doing wasn't invisible and wasn't anonymous. And I think as a photographer, you get quite a bit more leeway than as a journalist, because they know that, even if they don't necessarily agree with the truth of what you're photographing, they probably relate to the idea that at least it's a fact, This is pre-AI deep fakes, so, maybe future generations won't believe that. But at the time, there was a certain, purity to the idea that the photographs were fair representatives of what was happening.
If anything, they validate everything that they're going to be talking about, assuming that they're going to be talking about it when they get home. Some people never say a word. But to those who do say it, this is what I saw, this is what happened, your photographs and photographs taken by photographers comparable to you, that adds credibility to it. Again, today you could question that, but like you said, back then, that validated all of the stories that these people were bringing home from the war front.
Yeah, absolutely. And through the years, over the course of these last 15 years, I've gotten many emails from people who kind of discovered their pictures when searching maybe for a place in Iraq or Afghanistan or a unit name or a time period and found themselves in their pictures. And then tracked me down and emailed me and asked to have like a copy and things like that. It's always really interesting.
We're going to take a breather right now, take a short break, and we come back more with Peter van Agtmael and his new book, Sorry for the War. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. The best way to support the show is by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For links to gear and more information on today's guests, check out the show notes in your podcast app or visit our homepage on the B&H Explorer website and join the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group. And now, back to the show.
Okay, we are back. John, you have a short list of questions to start off with. Go ahead, take it.
Well, it's a long list for sure. And thank you again, Peter, for taking this time and for sharing these thoughts with us. I wanted to speak a bit about the book because, this is your fourth book on the subject. And to some degree, they each take a look at the behind the scenes of the wars as well as, the horrors and the battlefront and the home front. But what about the new book? What about Sorry for the War that kind of makes it different? And I'm talking about in content, not form necessarily. But what was it that you wanted to get said in this book that you didn't really find came out in the others?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I never anticipated doing this many books, and honestly, there's books still to come. I kind of have ideas for the next couple decades, probably at this point, about where to take this story, continue to take this story forward. But this process has been a series of certain ideas kind of coalescing around a single theme. In the first two books, it was really about the American military at war and what happens when the war comes home, largely dealing with the injured from the wars and those that were lost to the wars. So it's very military centric, especially American military centric, trying to look at that that perspective on the wars, as fully and deeply as possible and as personally as possible. And that process of doing that work, and especially coming home, provoked in me a lot of questions about the United States, which really led to this book, Buzzing at the Sill, which was partly an exploration of my own motivations in doing this work, because I thought, using my own memories and my own influences as kind of a vehicle for talking about a young person's, especially a young man's, attraction to war was kind of an important stand-in for more universal things. I think in the end, that I was so influenced by kind of family history and the military and at war and society's kind of fetishization of war that my experience, though I decided to become a photographer rather than a soldier, was really mirrored by so many of the people I'd met along the way. So I wanted to include that in kind of a book form. But simultaneous to that, I was starting to try and understand, well, what led our country to war in the first place? What are the conditions and the terms of society, and what's kind of left unresolved at home while these wars are fought abroad, which kind of inevitably, led me into a lot of explorations of kind of race and class in this country. And so that all got kind of unpacked in different stages at Buzzing at the Sill. But as I was finishing that book, I'd realized through kind of my own thinking and conversations with friends that there were some really big, deep themes about these wars that were left sort of relatively unexplored. One critical theme being, in the America-centricity of the work, I wasn't looking hardly at all at the Iraqis and Afghans kind of caught in the middle of these conflicts, both at war and in the mass exiles that have followed particularly violent stages of these wars. So I resolved to do that because there was, we've been fighting these conflicts for decades now, largely over, but we hardly knew a face or a name of the people that were caught in the middle of it. Most of them, of course, completely innocent, who's had their lives ruined by them. So that became an important thing to kind of look at in depth, and that kind of dovetailed to some degree with the rise of ISIS. So it was a good opportunity to be able to go back into these conflict areas unembedded and get the kind of magazine assignments that would actually let me do the work, because it's enormously expensive otherwise to do on one's own. Embedding is very cheap because everything is paid for essentially by the taxpayer dollars. But when you're not embedded, it's, you have to play it real safe, and that comes at a high cost. So there was that aspect. And then the other aspect in Sorry for the War was that I really felt like I hadn't gotten deep enough into kind of militarism and nationalism and kind of myth-making in society. Some of the key factors that kind of created the conditions for these wars and sustain these wars and will probably influence whatever future wars we fight. And so I wanted to kind of look at those things in depth. And I wanted to kind of highlight the disconnect between, those societal aspects and the people caught in the middle, and weave those two things together. And that's what became Sorry for the War.
Formally, the new book is a bit different, at least from Disco. And it's a smaller book, almost has a textbook. If I know textbooks aren't much of a common thing any longer, but it has that size to it. And all the caption information is at the end of the book, and the photos are there to kind of lead you there, I suppose. Were these decisions that you made intentionally? How did those come about to make this book the way it is? And was that done in relationship with the publisher, or was it something you had that you put forward?
Yeah, I mean, I've been hugely involved in designing every one of my books. I mean, every design I've done is really a collaboration, because I feel like, just as in setting the terms of what the book's supposed to be about and how I convey what the book is about through editing and sequencing, the form the final book takes is an equally critical part of communicating a message. So, that to me, that can be done in conjunction with the designer, but not by a designer exclusively. And luckily for a lot of these books, I've worked with Bonnie Bryant, who's amazing and like a fantastic collaborator in every way. And, she talked about a good gut checker. She lets me take things where I think they should go, but when they're not working, she doesn't hesitate to let me know that they're not. So that's hugely helpful. But in terms of the captions, everything is a compromise in a way. There's the text for me is equally important to the pictures. And especially with kind of Second Tour Hope I Don't Die and Disco Night, September 11th, and even the most recent kind of little book I did about 2020, all the text is next to the pictures. Mm-hmm. But in some of these books, Sorry for the War, Buzzing at the Sill, namely, I wanted the pictures to be able to tell a story independently of the text. That's just what felt right ultimately. I made different designs, some with the text side by side, some with the pictures taking center stage. And in the end, I decided that the pictures taking center stage would be the right move, with the text in the back with little thumbnails, so people could relate back to the pictures if they needed to down the road. The fact is, it could have gone either way. It was partly a decision to keep a modestly sized book where the detail of the pictures, which is usually sometimes extensive because they're, sometimes the pictures are loud and sometimes they're very quiet, and you need a little bit of scale in order to properly read what they're trying to accomplish. So, and I didn't want a big, vast coffee table book, which I would have needed if I had put the text with the pictures. So it was like a series of, like anything else, I kind of tried to determine what it was I wanted to do and what I wanted to say, and what offered the least compromises to get there. That being said, now I'm working on something that's kind of consolidating all these books, these 5 books, into this one era of time, this kind of American, the post 9/11 world, and all the fault lines and kind of the many complexities and contradictions of our identity as Americans and as a nation itself in the world. And that's a huge book, as you can guess. And as a result, but it's also, it's meant to be a narrative, it's meant to be a more traditional narrative rather than just kind of like a poetic nonlinear narrative. And so in that case, the text is center stage with the pictures, because the concept for it is being designed around, a public that is perhaps less attuned to the kind of subtleties of the traditional photo book, which is, can be difficult to unpack for someone who doesn't really know the language of how photo books are constructed. Right. It's a long way of saying that at some point, partway through this process, I realized that all these books themselves were just chapters in one big book. And the work itself takes on a different identity and a different meaning depending on how it's edited and sequenced. So I could do the individual chapters, the individual books in one way, but working towards a larger book that did it in a different way. And then they all complemented one another as a result, and all played their own role that was both kind of unified but also singular.
Well, again, great answer. Thank you so much. I want to maybe jump to
as
another.
My partner says, do you just narrate these things in your head when no one's around? Like, so, and it's partly accurate. So, you want to know how the sausage is made.
Exactly. Well, it's impressive. I mean, as we speak to a lot of photographers, and some, as great as the work is, they have a hard time speaking about their work. But I did want to mention real quickly before we change subjects a bit, in Disco Night, September 11th, there you have what I believe they call them gatefolds. I'm not exactly sure that's the right term, but where, the page folds open to reveal a couple other images. And I've really found that effective because it kind of opens, it opens a little door into secondary meanings of the main image, I guess. I don't know if that's what you thought about how you want to do it, but
no, that's exactly right.
I'm looking at a photo now of an injured soldier on an operating table, and then you open it up to find more, and it just, all the images don't necessarily link as you thematically, but they certainly have meaning when they're placed one next to one another. So I thought that was a really effective form.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was, as you say, it was about telling stories within the story. There are 189 pictures in Disco Night, September 11th. a 189 picture nonlinear sequence is very hard to want to get through. And not every picture is good in there. But sometimes okay pictures that help tell a story have a role. And I just didn't want to bog down the main sequence with pictures that I didn't necessarily think drove the sequence, but still played an important role in the storytelling. And so the gatefolds was the solution I found. I mean, in retrospect, would I've put sort of 19 or whatever gatefolds in there? I probably maybe would have cut it down a little bit, but the premise, I think was a good one, and I'm glad I did it.
Even with movies, there's always an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. So those secondary pictures, again, support the main photograph. So there's a good reason for that. It's part of the narrative. It's a story.
Yeah, exactly. And stories, and it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell the story the way I wanted to. I mean, in the end, these things are so personal to me. They've defined my life. They've changed my life. And I want to get it right. And what does that mean, getting it right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, every time I do a book, all I notice are its flaws usually afterwards. But at the same time, I'm satisfied with them. I can still say, I can look at them and say, okay, I said what I wanted to say, what I needed to say with this book. And I can feel confident in kind of moving on.
Something I was a little bit curious about, I wanted to talk about, if I may, is that looking at your photographs over time, it's impossible not to recognize how digital cameras have evolved since you started using them early on. Your earliest images that are obviously digital have a real granular quality to them because you were shooting under low light, and CCD sensors back then just couldn't handle it. And they have a painterly quality that at times is actually gorgeous. It kind of I found that kind of jarring, where I'm looking at these pictures and saying, wow, that's beautiful, but it's not a beautiful picture. Did you have that same kind of conflict? And also, after answering that one, how has digital imaging, at what point did you feel that you really got the digital imaging was where you needed it to be? Because obviously today, some of those pictures you took back then would be so much more brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by answering that question with responding to someone in the first part of the question, which really leads to the second part. This question of sort of so-called good photography, and I'm a self-taught photographer. I took one course in college in the kind of art school, and then afterwards just really learned it on my own. So I didn't have any institutionally built-in notions of what was good photography and what wasn't.
No preconceptions.
I didn't have the education in it. I didn't have friends really that were photographers. So it was really for the years, kind of the first 6-7 years, really, I was working as a photographer. Almost exclusively, I was determining what I liked and what I related to and what it was about photography that communicated to me without any pressures, which in retrospect was a huge blessing, so I could kind of start crafting my ideas of what photography was supposed to be on my own, which was, and continues to be, and has even expanded far outwards into, sometimes a good photograph that communicates is a conventionally beautiful photograph. Sometimes it's something more like a snapshot. Sometimes it's, something very kind of rough around the edges, but very emotional. Sometimes it's something very carefully thought out in a way and refined. Sometimes it's a portrait. Sometimes it's a still life. Sometimes it's something more like reportage. Sometimes more of a landscape. Sometimes it's just a screen grab off of a telephone. It's all valid in my mind. And so, I didn't have this great preciousness about so-called good photography. That began to come only when I got into Magnum, and I was, relatively young, 27 and not very well known at all in the photojournalism community. I hadn't been a part of it. And I remember an enormous amount of negative feedback coming my way in the early period, which now I kind of mark down partly as, I guess, just not kind of getting what I was after, but just talking about just kind of what a bad photographer I was, which goes into the technical aspect a little bit of these early, and the relationship between technology and my work, which is a really strong one. I'm glad you asked the question because it's a really important part of my process and one that no one ever asks about. I think it's the first time I've been asked that question. I think I've been kind of dying to be asked that question for a long time.
2 points.
So thanks for that.
Way to go, Alan.
2 points. Yeah, it's
take it.
And to me, what I was seeing again, when you don't have anybody telling you what's a good picture and what's a bad picture, I was just seeing what the cameras themselves were capable of, and as bad as these early CCD cameras were, and I didn't even have the top of the line cameras because I couldn't afford them, so it was even a bit worse than the average thing. But what I did see was that, especially at night, you were able to take pictures in color with a sort of fidelity that just simply didn't exist before. And so as rough as the technology was, it was also pushing the parameters forward of what could be photographed. And that was really exciting. And it just so happened that a lot of the things I was seeing in Iraq were occurring at night. And so when I was looking at the pictures, I didn't see their flaws. I saw something different than what I'd seen before, and that really excited me. So at first, I was just utterly baffled when people were saying, "What's with the rough pictures?" And at some point, I remember someone coming up to me, another photographer, being like, "No, I know these guys don't get it, but I get it. It was an aesthetic choice." I was like, "Aesthetic choice?" It's like I was pushing the limits of the cameras because I had no choice. The aesthetics didn't even. It didn't come to mind. Right. That being said, like I don't have a great feeling of preciousness or nostalgia towards that roughness and grittiness. As cameras have evolved, I've tried to kind of evolve with them, and I do try and kind of stay on the edge of technology, just simply because of what it can do. I took a lot of pictures in the last couple of years using just a 1-inch sensor on a Sony camera with a sort of 24 to 600 millimeter lens, like an absurd camera, with a small sensor by conventional standards.
Sure, we know the camera. Sure.
Yeah, but it's like it's a piece of technology that can do things because of its depth of field and its vast, zoom range and a very compact body that you simply couldn't do before with other cameras. So you can see the world differently through the technology. The technology is an intrinsic part in seeing the world differently. So, with the newer cameras, I'm using like a Sony, A1 these days and a Fuji GFX 50, these are just incredible tools in all kinds of conditions. And so if I look back at some of the Iraq pictures that are at night and raw, and they're very close because there just isn't enough detail in the sensor, there's too much noise and there's not enough detail to really take hyper detail oriented pictures. Now I can take pictures, at 50 megapixels at night with very little noise, handheld, that allow me to see the scene in a more expansive way that I wouldn't be able to see if I knew that the picture could only be successful with a certain number of elements in it. So this is just a long way of saying that technology has played this really major role in the way I see, because it's allowed the individual practitioner to see more. And so if you're being responsive to that and finding out, trying to understand what the limitations of the technology are, you can push your own limitations out further every time. Same thing with drones, for example, too. I mean, I use drones extensively these days as well. Partly, again, it's simply another perspective that never would have existed before. It's hard to take a good drone picture, but it's possible.
In the sense of filing your work and mobile technology, and did that change during your times? It must have changed, obviously, during your time in the battlefields. I mean, did you experience a better, or let's say a more efficient way to get your work filed, and were you able to file work from the field?
When I started, I was using what was called a BGAN. I don't know if anyone uses these things anymore. It's a satellite modem, a small satellite modem. It was like a little plastic laptop-sized kind of dish that you orient towards a satellite, as you were kind of joking about earlier today. But in this case, it was true, and it could kind of transfer, files at 1 megabyte a minute for like an enormous cost. I don't know. It's like $5 a megabyte or $10 a megabyte, something crazy. So I had to make these super small files and transmit them through that, and have to be really judicious in my editing because it was so expensive. But over time, obviously now mobile technology has become omnipresent throughout the world. That, like, if I'm in Iraq or whatever, or Afghanistan, I can, with T-Mobile roaming, international roaming, I can be like looking at Instagram in the middle of a battle. So it's a little bit, it's not advised to do that, but the technology of transmission has made life a heck of a lot easier in many ways.
Talking about technology, and this is a little bit apart from what we've been talking about, technology has changed in every aspect of our life. And you've been going out to battlefields for a couple of decades now. Has technology made your job out there more dangerous? It's always been dangerous. It's always been iffy, and it's always been a crapshoot. Is it more so now, or is it kind of the same but different?
Well, I mean, there are material connections between technology and danger. If I think in recent years, there was a well-known example in Homs in Syria, and I think it was 2012, I believe, the incident in which Marie Colvin was killed, where the Syrian artillery, using kind of Russian technology, was able to zero in on where there was data transmissions coming from satellite modems in a media center and direct, via GPS, their shelling towards this media tower and kill, this sort of legendary journalist and
Right.
and Rami Ochlik, the photographer that was with her at the time.
Right.
So technology has definitely played this role in creating danger. I remember when I was covering the Battle of Mosul a few years ago, beyond all the conventional parts of war that I'd grown accustomed to, they were using weaponized drones there extensively for the first time. So, kind of death could come from anywhere, including a little buzzing drone dropping a hand grenade on your head kind of thing. So it's definitely, it makes life easier. It also, to some degree, makes life more dangerous.
Yeah.
It's clear that you're a student of photography, a student of history. And, there's been many great photographers have been kind of looking at the home front, as it were, and the damage that has been done by the wars. How has your view of photography changed? I mean, I can imagine to some degree you started with an attitude that, perhaps my photos can make a difference. Do you still feel that way, or is it really more about just this idea of bearing witness and being there to say that, I did my part and I put these images out. I'm speaking my piece. How do you look at the role of photography when it comes to war?
I mean, I do think they can still make a difference, not just images of war, but images of kind of societies in change and upheaval. Last year in 2020 and into this year, I kind of, partly because I am a keen kind of student of history in a lot of ways, I really saw 2020 shaping up to be this sort of the most climactic year in American history since 1968 in many ways, with all the layers of things that were going on in society, from the sort of resurgent civil rights movement to the beginning of the pandemic to the elections to the political upheaval. There was, and I sort of resolved to cover all of it if I could, and I largely did, and I wanted to really, and most of it I did on assignment and through the press, and I got a lot of emails in that period, which were really heartening, of people that, were looking at this work and it was helping them kind of understand a little bit what was happening in the world around them and draw conclusions, combined with many other photographers and journalists and filmmakers and documentary makers. I don't believe in this kind of, photography is a bit of a lone wolf profession, but we are all working kind of in service to some degree of like-minded ideas. And so, it's the broader tradition that I think does have a lot of impact. I would doubt, the significance of my own individual impact, but as part of a broader institution, I think it does have an enormous influence. We don't know we're so used to a free and pretty vibrant press that we don't know what our world would look like in the absence of it. So that alone to me is reason to kind of continue, and believe in it, and simultaneously, the books are important too, because, the internet and daily news is ephemeral, but books in their ideally, are robust and kind of built to last and built to be used as kind of tools for history to understand the era too. And so that's the kind of the combination, I guess, I try and do in my work, the work that is for the present, which is through the press, and then the work that's for history through the books.
Well, we are moving on here in time here. It is time to wrap up. Peter van Agtmael, pleasure speaking with you. Very, very informative. Your work is wonderful, and you speak very clearly about it, which is makes it all that much better. If people want to catch up to see more of your work, see where your books are available, where can they go to?
Thank you. Yeah, the best places to go to get the books are massbooks.co, and which is the publisher, or my website, petervanagtmael.net. Yeah, petervanagtmael.net. I mean, not an easy one to spell or remember.
All of this will be on our show notes. So
I hope there's a link to it.
We will have links to all of this. Absolutely.
Yeah, you spell it just the way it sounds. That'll make it easy for everyone. And the books are still available. There are not a lot of anything left. So if people are interested, by all means, purchase soon, because probably pretty soon I'll be raising the prices pretty dramatically, because I'm kind of down to my last 100 copies on a lot of the books. So, and I'm not really going to reprint anytime soon, because I'm working on this next thing for 2023 about that kind of consolidates a lot of the work in those books into one book, but also kind of redefines it pretty dramatically too. So it's going to be a very different book, even though it's going to include a lot of the work in those books.
Well, I know John ain't parting with his. I already tried bribing him a few times. He's keeping his copies, so I'm skunked on those. I have to wait to see what else is coming out. That's terrific. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure and very enriching speaking with you today. And best of luck on all these future endeavors.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
If you enjoy listening to the B&H Photography Podcast and you're not yet a subscriber, you know what to do. Simply head on over to wherever you snag your favorite podcast and sign up. It is absolutely free. And if you're already a subscriber, take a moment and leave a few kind words, the kind that make us feel all tingly inside. And you can always find us on the B&H Explorer website and on the B&H Photography Podcast Facebook group page. My name is Alan Weitz, and on behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables, thank you so much for tuning in today.